Dr. Gopinath, thank you so much for joining NDTV. You're in India for these G20 meetings at a time that we have taken over the G20 presidency. What do you see as the significance of India's G20 presidency?
Hi, Sonia. The way I see it, the global economy is going through a difficult period, and there are many global challenges. And with India taking over the presidency, I think there is a lot of optimism of being able to address several of these challenges that require cooperation across the world. So as an example, when you think of food security and energy security, it requires cross-country collaboration. We have many countries with very high levels of debt and that are entering debt distress. For that to be able to provide debt resolution, global cooperation is needed. We need work on the crypto front, similarly on climate finance. So all of these are big actions that are required, and India is a champion of the global south and therefore has a very important role to play through its presidency.
Taking up on that point you've made on India, the champion of the global south, what specifically are the areas which you think India as a representative of these concerns of developing emerging economies will take up during this 1 year?
There are several. I would say one important area is on digital inclusion. India has really been a pioneer and at the forefront of building up digital public infrastructure. The policy design has been very smart to be able to make sure that it's widely available, and all the applications are bearing fruit when it comes to raising, for instance, tax revenues, but also making sure that spending is much more targeted, social spending is much more targeted, and more generally, greater financial inclusion for a large number of people. And this, for instance, is a model that many other countries in the global south can emulate and they look up to in terms of what India has managed to achieve. So this is one area. A second area which India cares a lot about is in the matter of debt. The G20 produced the what's called the common framework, which is to help countries that have high levels of debt distress restructure their debt. It's a process that has moved in fits and starts. It has made some progress, but we need things to move much more in a timely manner. And India is pushing hard to make concrete progress on that front. And the third area is crypto, where again India has views on how to regulate the crypto landscape and what are the benefits and costs for society. So that's another third area.
Absolutely. And in fact, Gita Gopinath, the other aspect which we're all looking at, in fact, I remember the last time we spoke in January 2022, we were just coming out of the COVID pandemic and global recession, and there was much hope. But then the Ukraine war hit the world. Now, the Prime Minister Modi, has told President Putin that this is not the era of war. What do you think the cost of war has been on the global economy, especially going now into 2023?
The war has been very, very costly. It's a major humanitarian crisis, of course, in Ukraine and an economic crisis with the Ukrainian economy projected to shrink by a third this year because of Russia's invasion. But we see spillovers to the rest of the world. I mean, Europe is very hard hit by gas prices. We've seen food insecurity rise, especially as fertilizer production has slowed around the world and there's been restriction of exports out of Ukraine. So more generally, it has fed into a cost of living crisis around the world. So it's costly. We estimated in October that just looking at the events that happened in this particular year, about $4 trillion was shaved out of global economy. So it's a very substantial hit, and everybody agrees that this war needs to end. It's the only way we can ensure prosperity and bring back stability into the world.
Right, and you talked also, Ms. Gopinath, Dr. Gopinath, about this whole aspect of energy security. Now, India has been very strong in making the point that we will buy oil from wherever it's needed, including Russia. We've been criticized by Europe for this. Mr. Jaishankar, the External Affairs Minister, has called out European double standards. What's your take on this, India's stand on buying Russian oil?
From the world's perspective, what is important is to make sure that the supply of oil on the market remains at a high level, right? Which then would require that there are buyers. on the other side. And so India buying oil, for instance, from Russia is completely consistent with the price cap strategy that was rolled out very recently between the US and Europe. So, that would be consistent. We do need supply to come on to the market, and if countries like India can get it at the lower price with the price cap, I think that's perfectly fine.
Mm-hmm. So do you agree that there have been, in that sense, double standards by the United States, by Europe, by Western countries when it comes to looking at, say, the global South and India's geopolitical stance, especially in buying oil or doing business with countries like Russia?
Well, I don't necessarily. I think we are in a period where there are a lot of geopolitical tensions. There are countries who feel differently about how exactly to react to this war. We certainly have that. And one of the positives of the G20 is that you bring together everybody to have these open conversations and move forward. So I think these frictions and tensions will always remain, but I actually do see progress being made. I have to say, after February and the invasion that happened, I was quite concerned about what the G20 could deliver. But by the end, and when we had the Leaders Summit in November in Bali, I felt hopeful that actually this forum could deliver. Mm-hmm.
And also various global reports and global agencies have projected that India is projected to become the world's third largest economy by 2030. What's your view on the decade ahead? Is this going to be India's decade economically on the global front?
I'd say there's a lot of optimism about India right now from people I talk to externally, but also people that I'm talking to in India. India, I would say, is a relative bright spot in terms of the growth landscape. Again, we have projected global growth to slow down to 2.7% next year, with about a third of countries having negative growth this year or next year. Mm-hmm. So in comparative terms, India is doing well. And there is a keen interest to diversify imports from just relying on a couple of countries to more countries. And I think India is benefiting from that. It certainly see more countries wanting to do their manufacturing in India. These are positives. I think the digital public infrastructure in India is very attractive. The general investment that's happened in infrastructure more generally has been very well recognized. There's, of course, a lot more work that needs to be done, but there is a lot of hope too.
Mm-hmm. So what would you identify, of course, as somebody who's studied in India, from India, what would you identify as the key challenges and opportunities for India? Because, of course, one of the axioms here is that in India, that two contradictory things can be completely true at the same time. So at the one hand, the number of Indian billionaires are growing, but we also see unemployment growing especially amongst the youth, as we are also projected to become the most populous country in the world in a few years.
In terms of challenges, I agree with what you just said in terms of the labor market and employment. Creating sufficient jobs, creating high quality jobs is going to be a challenge for India. We've seen employment recover, but it still remains low. And if you look at female labor force participation, youth labor force participation, it's at very low levels. So a lot more work is needed on that front to be able to create enough jobs and to be able to make sure that they're high quality jobs. A second area of challenge will be in terms of fiscal consolidation. These are difficult times. There are lots of vulnerable people. On the positive side, India is doing very well in terms of revenue collection. This is coming through GST, but also through income tax. And again, the digital public infrastructure has a very important role that is playing in able to get higher yields from taxes. But expenditures have also gone up. And so the way to make sure that you actually have a sound fiscal position over the years, you need to have a medium-term fiscal framework, right, fiscal rules. I'd say that's the second challenge. In terms of opportunities, of course, there are also several. Like I said, everybody is looking to India as a source for diversifying away where they buy from. Mm-hmm. And for India to be able to get into the global supply chain much more prominently, that I think is an important opportunity. Recently, India has entered trade agreements with the UAE, with Australia, and they're trying to do that with more countries. I think that's a positive step. But more generally, India's trade policy should move towards making sure that there are inputs that can be purchased, that you can get the right relevant inputs into the country, because otherwise it's going to be very hard to attract foreign direct investment at a much larger scale.
Right. So that point you're making, just to pick up on the whole global looking at diversification of, say, maybe manufacturing inputs coming in, this is the right time, you feel, for India to perhaps capitalize on the slowdown in China?
There is certainly a keen interest in many countries to move away from relying exclusively on China to other markets. And India is a country that has that opportunity and can seize that opportunity. You're certainly seeing that. Now, foreign direct investment into India has remained about stable at around 2%. If you want to raise that more, a lot more will need to be done. Again, good action has been taken on infrastructure. That's very good. New agreements, trade agreements will help. But more will be needed, for instance, when it comes to labor policy, when it comes to land policy, to be able to completely seize the opportunity.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because, of course, sometimes you see people within India saying there's too much democracy, and that sometimes is a hurdle to those changes that you're talking about. But really, isn't India's democracy, as compared to what we see in China and Russia, one of the key factors for India's growth and attractiveness to international investors?
Absolutely. I mean, India's democracy is one of the factors that makes India an attractive destination for investors around the world.
Mm-hmm. And also, Dr. Gopinath, when we had last talked at the beginning of the year, you had talked about how at one time, of course, the world was hit by the Great Depression, and how with COVID, we saw a global recession. But now some good news coming in on inflation. This is something the IMF had flagged as a big concern globally. But what would you say on the latest US figures and Indian figures, which is showing some stability regarding inflation rates?
So in October, we had projected that global inflation would peak this year. Mm-hmm. And we're talking about headline inflation, would peak this year and decline slowly. But importantly, what we said is that it would take several quarters for inflation to come back down to targets. The data that we're seeing is very much in line with that projection. We've seen, for instance, in the US, 2 months of positive news on the inflation front, with inflation coming down. But at the same time, the more sticky components of inflation, which is what the central banks care about, has been high at 6%. So, what we expect to see is monetary policy staying the course. Mm-hmm. They've tightened quite substantially over the last several months. I mean, in terms of historical comparisons, this is a really very fast pace of tightening. And now going forward, we expect to see more modest tightening to happen. And I think the bigger question then is, how long do you keep interest rates at that level? As of now, we see that the US Fed, for instance, would likely need to hold until the end of 2023 at least. But we'll see as we see more incoming data. So we are entering a period, looking ahead, where financial conditions will remain tight. We will see the consequences of all the tightening that's happened play out in the world. We have concerns about China and China's growth, which of course has implications for the rest of the world. So there are many headwinds. The energy markets are still not settled. And I'd say the next 6 months could be quite turbulent.
Mm-hmm. So as we draw to the end of 2022, looking ahead to, perhaps a turbulent 2023, what would you today, as a global economist, say to the world's politicians?
I would say that what's absolutely critical is to make sure that you have inclusive recoveries, sustainable recoveries, and ensure that employment is protected as best possible, because that is absolutely essential to make sure that the right reforms can happen in their countries.
Inclusive and sustainable recovery, Gita Gopinath. I think that's advice everyone should be listening to. Thank you so much for joining us on NDTV. Thank you.